The protagonists sat quietly in the kitchen, pouring themselves a cup of coffee when they heard their dad's voice rise from the living room. It sounded like he was on the phone with someone, but his words were muffled and indistinct. Curious, the protagonist leaned closer to the door and strained to hear, thinking it was just another one of those boring, mundane conversations he often had with friends. Big surprise. I've got something planned, when she's away this weekend. The protagonist raised an eyebrow. Asterisk surprise? What surprise? Asterisk their mom had been planning a short weekend getaway with some of her friends. It was all planned, she'd been talking about it for weeks. But their dad? Their dad had never been the romantic type. He was the kind of guy who'd order a pizza and call it a date night. So, hearing him talk about a big surprise felt strange. No, it's not that. I've got it all figured out. It's going to be perfect. She'll love it. The protagonist's interest piqued. Love it? This didn't sound like their dad at all. In fact, it sounded like something a person would do if they were trying to salvage a disaster of a marriage or maybe trying to remind their partner why they fell in love. But their parents weren't exactly in trouble, at least not that the protagonist had noticed. The protagonist leaned in closer, now fully invested in this conversation. They could only make out bits and pieces of what their dad was saying, but one thing was clear: he was planning something extravagant. And that thought sparked an idea. What if their dad was about to pull off some massive romantic gesture, and the protagonist had no idea? Maybe their dad was going to try and make up for all those years of not being the romantic type. Maybe he was going to surprise their mom with something truly incredible. The idea quickly grew in the protagonist's mind. Asterisk, this is it. This is the moment where he finally pulls it together. This is going to be huge. Asterisk, they began imagining what the surprise could be: a grand dinner, flowers, candles, something to reignite the spark in their parents' relationship. Maybe even something sexy to make their mom feel special: lingerie, a getaway weekend? Oh, the possibilities! The protagonist, giddy with excitement, made a decision. They had to make sure this surprise was memorable. If Dad was going to make this happen, then it had to be perfect. They could already see how this could unfold: beautiful, heartwarming, romantic. They even pictured the conversation the next morning. "Oh, honey, that surprise was incredible." "Yeah, I helped with that," the protagonists would think, silently basking in their own glory. They suddenly snapped back to reality when their dad's voice echoed louder from the living room again. "Yeah, I'm thinking of having everything ready by Friday night. A little dinner, a little wine, and then..." His voice trailed off, and the protagonist couldn't make out the rest of the words. But the sentence was enough. Friday night, that's when the big event was happening. The protagonists began to hatch a plan. Asterisk, I can't let Dad mess this up. This has to be flawless. It's about time we do something right in this house. Asterisk, they immediately decided they would interfere, but for the better. After all, the surprise couldn't just be a boring dinner or a simple gift. No. It had to be something spectacular. They would make sure it was even better than their dad had planned. In fact, they would help him out. They could already see it: the perfect night for their mom, and they would be the hero behind it all. The plan was simple, at least in theory. They'd do a little shopping, get a few extra gifts to complement their dad's plans, throw in some extra surprises, and create a fun, lively atmosphere to really spice things up. This would be the kind of thing that would make their mom's friends jealous. Their dad would look like the perfect husband, and the protagonist? Well, they'd be the hero behind the scenes, of course. The excitement bubbled up inside them as they started running through the details in their mind. First, they'd need to get some fancy lingerie for their mom, something bold and daring, something that would make her blush. Then maybe some aphrodisiac foods. Was that a thing? Yeah, it was a thing. Chocolate-covered strawberries, oysters, maybe even some champagne. They didn't know how to make it all happen, but that's why they were going to be the secret mastermind. They figured they'd also need to make the evening more fun. A little dancing, a little alcohol, a few laughs. Maybe they could even invite a few of their dad's old friends, the ones from that wild party they had back in the 90s. The ones who still thought they were in their 20s. They would come, bring the energy, and just let the whole night become a spontaneous, carefree celebration of love and life. Nothing could go wrong, right? The protagonist's mind was racing. There were endless possibilities, and every single one of them felt like it was going to be a wild success. They could already see the night unfolding: candles, romantic music, laughter, a glass of wine in their hand as they helped make the night unforgettable. This was going to be the night. The perfect night. But then, their excitement started to deflate a little. What if they got it wrong? What if they overdid it? What if their dad was just planning a simple evening, and they accidentally turned it into something completely bizarre? No. They couldn't let that happen. This had to be perfect. Mom would love it, and Dad would be impressed. Still, the nagging doubt stayed with them. The idea of helping was tempting, but also risky. Would their dad be grateful, or would he freak out and accuse them of ruining the surprise? Would their mom find it charming, or would she just be embarrassed? But those thoughts didn't last long. The plan was set. They were going to make sure this surprise was one that no one would ever forget. The protagonist grabbed their phone and started texting a few friends. "I need your help to pull off something huge this weekend. You in?" The protagonist couldn't wait to get started. They didn't want to waste a single second. Friday was only a few days away, and they had to make sure everything was ready. They quickly got to work, first stopping by the store to pick up the essentials: lingerie, champagne, chocolate-covered strawberries, aphrodisiac foods. They had no idea if any of it would actually work, but it all sounded good in theory. Plus, it had to be perfect. They had to make sure the surprise would blow their mom away. They could already imagine it, the moment their dad would present their mom with these beautiful, thoughtful gifts. The surprise would be so overwhelming that she'd cry tears of joy. The protagonist would stand back, casually acting like they had nothing to do with it, but secretly feeling like the world's greatest mastermind. They grabbed everything they could think of: gourmet chocolate, fancy wine glasses, even some candles to set the mood. They were going all in. After all, if Dad was going to try something big, they'd make sure it was as huge as possible. There was no room for mediocrity here. It had to be jaw-dropping. The next step was getting the dance contest going. The protagonist had the perfect idea. They were going to turn their living room into the ultimate dance floor, one that would get everyone's energy up. Dad's surprise was probably going to be some quiet, intimate dinner, but why settle for that when you could have a full-on dance-off, right? They started texting a few of Dad's old friends, telling them to be ready for a wild night. People who hadn't seen each other in years were about to get together and relive the good old days. Because that's what surprises were all about, right? Making people remember what it was like when they were young, vibrant, and carefree. But as they texted their dad's old buddies, a sense of doubt crept in. Was this the right move? What if their dad didn't want a dance contest? What if he just wanted a quiet evening? The protagonist shook off the thought. This wasn't about what Dad wanted. This was about what would make the night unforgettable. And if that meant turning their house into a nightclub for the night, so be it. Their dad might not even notice the difference. The protagonist's phone buzzed with a reply from one of the old friends. "Are you sure about this? Dance contest? I mean, are we all still in shape for that?" The protagonists rolled their eyes. "Of course you are. Don't worry. It'll be fun. Trust me." They hit send before doubting themselves again. It's going to work. It has to work. They moved on to the next task, getting the aphrodisiac foods ready. They had no idea what made food aphrodisiac, but they had a feeling chocolate was a good place to start. They grabbed a box of the most expensive, extravagant chocolate they could find. If there was one thing they knew about their mom, it was that she loved sweet things. Chocolate-covered strawberries would surely do the trick. They returned home and started setting up the living room. The idea was to create an environment that would make their mom feel like she was the center of attention, the queen of the night. The lights were dimmed, candles were lit, and the music started to fill the air. Everything was coming together. But then the anxiety set in. They had done so much already, and yet it didn't feel like enough. They needed something more, something to really blow everyone away. They had an idea. A dance contest. It was genius, they decided. Who wouldn't love a good competition? The energy in the house would be electric, and it would make everyone feel young again. The protagonists could already picture the scene, their dad, trying to impress their mom with his smooth dance moves, while their mom looked on, a little embarrassed but secretly enjoying the attention. It would be hilarious. The protagonists didn't even care if they got everything right. As long as the dance-off went according to plan, everything else could fall into place. They just needed to make sure the guests didn't overdo it. Things could get out of hand quickly, especially with Dad's old friends involved. But the protagonist was determined. They had everything under control. They were going to make this night legendary. And then, their phone buzzed again. Another text from one of Dad's friends. Are we really going to do this? I mean, we're not in high school anymore. The protagonist took a deep breath. Trust me. This is going to be the best night ever. No backing out. They pressed send and walked over to the box of chocolates. They started placing them strategically around the room. Candles. Chocolates. Champagne. It was all coming together. The protagonist was practically bursting with pride at the thought of how everything would look, how everything would feel when it was all set in motion. Their mom would be stunned. Their dad would be proud. And the protagonist would be the unsung hero behind it all, orchestrating every move. There was a knock at the door. The protagonist opened it, and one of Dad's friends walked in, holding a bottle of wine. Got the booze. Let's make this night unforgettable, he said with a grin. Perfect, the protagonist replied, already feeling the rush of adrenaline. This was going to be incredible. They turned back to the living room, feeling like everything was falling into place. There was just one more thing left to do, make sure everything was in order for the big night. But something still nagged at the back of their mind. They didn't know exactly what their dad had planned, but now it was too late to turn back. The protagonists stood in front of the mirror, giving themselves a final pep talk. Asterisk, you've got this. You're going to pull this off. You're going to make this night unforgettable. Asterisk, they grinned at their reflection. Tonight would be their greatest triumph yet. The day had arrived, and the protagonist was ready. Their plan was in full swing, and there was no turning back now. The house was set up just as they had imagined, candles flickering on every surface, soft music playing in the background, the living room looking like something straight out of a cheesy rom-com. Everything was perfect. All that was left was to wait for the clock to tick down, and see how their dad's big surprise would unfold. As the hours passed, the protagonist paced around, checking and rechecking everything. The chocolates were in place, the wine glasses were polished, and the dance floor area was cleared. Their heart raced with excitement, wondering what their dad was going to do. They had no clue what he had planned, but they were convinced it would be nothing compared to what they had orchestrated. This was going to be legendary. No doubt about it. Their dad hadn't mentioned anything about the surprise in days, and it was clear he had no idea just how much the protagonist had intervened. The protagonist had done everything with precision, making sure to subtly insert themselves into the process without drawing too much attention. It was all about creating the right atmosphere and making sure everyone had a blast, without their dad realizing who the real mastermind was. As evening approached, the tension in the air started to build. The protagonist stood by the door, anxiously waiting for their mom to arrive home from her trip. They could feel the anticipation swelling inside them. This was going to be the night. The night when they would become the unsung hero of the whole family, the person who saved their dad from making a complete fool of himself. There was just one last thing to do, get everyone in the right mindset. The protagonist shot a quick text to their dad's friends. Are you guys ready for this? Let's make it unforgettable. They hit send, and almost immediately, their phone buzzed with a reply. Hell yeah! Let's party! Moments later, the door opened, and their mom walked in, looking slightly worn out from her trip but still glowing with the radiance of someone who had just had a fun getaway. She smiled as she stepped inside, immediately noticing the setup. The candles, the wine glasses, the chocolates, everything seemed a little too perfect. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, clearly intrigued. "Wow, this looks fancy," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. The protagonist grinned, playing it cool. "Oh, it's just a little surprise. We thought you'd like it." Their mom's eyes narrowed as she walked further into the living room, taking in the ambience. "You know, I have a feeling I know who's behind this." "Maybe," the protagonist teased, avoiding direct eye contact. They didn't want to give anything away just yet. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first few guests, Dad's friends. The protagonist greeted them with a grin, trying to keep their cool. They were ready for the next step, and as the friends trickled in, the excitement only grew. It was happening. The big surprise. It was all going down right here, right now. As the group gathered in the living room, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a little smug. They had turned what was likely going to be an uneventful, quiet evening into something much bigger. The dance contest would be the centerpiece, but it wasn't just about the contest. It was about creating an experience. A night that would go down in family history as the most fun night anyone could remember. Soon, their dad appeared from the kitchen, looking a little confused by the atmosphere. He had clearly expected a much simpler evening. As he took in the setup, his face showed both surprise and confusion. What's all this?" he asked, glancing around the room. The protagonist's heart raced. "It's the surprise, Dad. You know, for Mom's return," they said, trying to keep it vague, not wanting to spoil the magic. Dad blinked, clearly thrown off by the lavish setup. "This isn't what I, had in mind." "Don't worry," the protagonist said with a wink. "It's going to be perfect. Trust me." The evening began to take shape. Wine was poured, and the guests gathered around, chatting and laughing. The protagonist made sure to keep the mood light and fun, encouraging everyone to get involved in the upcoming dance contest. Their dad, despite his hesitation, couldn't help but get swept up in the energy. He cracked a few jokes, trying to act casual, but it was clear he was a little out of his element. Mom watched him, still trying to process what was going on. "What exactly is the surprise?" she asked, her curiosity growing. The protagonist, with a sly smile, just said, "You'll see." The guests milled about, some nervously sipping wine, others adjusting their outfits as the first strains of music began to fill the room. The dance contest was about to begin, and everything was set. The protagonists couldn't hold back their excitement anymore. They clapped their hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, folks!" they shouted, a grin spreading across their face. "It's time to get this party started." The room went silent for a second, and then the music blasted through the speakers. It was an upbeat, fun track, something everyone could dance to. The protagonist immediately grabbed their dad's hand and pulled him into the middle of the floor. "Let's show them what you've got, Dad!" the protagonist shouted, encouraging their father to take the first step. The room erupted in laughter and applause as Dad awkwardly took the floor, unsure of what he was supposed to do. His dance moves were stiff, and his attempts at being smooth were downright hilarious. But the more he tried, the more the guests cheered him on. It was clear that their dad was trying to relive his youth, but the protagonist had no idea how out of his depth he truly was. They had expected something a little more sophisticated, but this was pure comedy gold. The protagonists barely kept a straight face as they watched their dad try to bust out some 90s moves that just didn't land. The guests, though, loved it. The energy in the room surged, and people started taking turns dancing. The atmosphere had completely shifted. What was supposed to be a quiet night of romance and relaxation had turned into a full-blown, hilarious, and spontaneous dance-off, and the protagonists knew they had hit the jackpot. The night was theirs. As the music played on, the atmosphere became more lively. Laughter filled the room as Dad continued his wildly uncoordinated attempts at dancing, completely oblivious to how ridiculous he looked. Each of his moves was met with a mixture of cheers and snickers from the guests, but that only fueled his determination. He wasn't backing down now. He was in full party mode, and nothing was going to stop him, not even the embarrassing reality that his rhythm was absolutely non-existent. The protagonists, standing on the sidelines, had to bite their lip to avoid laughing. Everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned, but the sheer comedy of it all was more than they had anticipated. They had imagined something funny, but this was pure gold. Dad was giving it his all, swinging his arms around wildly, doing some weird spin, and even trying to pull off a moonwalk that had everyone in stitches. The guests were loving it, though, and no one was about to stop the show. Mom was watching it all, her expression one of disbelief. She clearly didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified, but she was laughing too. As Dad spun around for what seemed like the 100th time, he lost his footing and crashed into the couch, sending a small group of guests into fits of laughter. He got back up, dusted himself off, and took a bow, as if he had just nailed the performance of a lifetime. "You're doing great, Dad!" the protagonists called out, trying to hold back their own laughter. They knew they couldn't keep their act together much longer. "Thanks, kid," Dad said, giving them a thumbs up. He was genuinely enjoying himself now, completely lost in the moment. The more ridiculous it got, the more he embraced the chaos, like a man who had discovered a hidden side of himself he never knew existed. It was oddly endearing. As the dance contest continued, more and more people started getting involved. It wasn't just Dad now, friends from the past were stepping up, showcasing their own moves, most of which were equally as disastrous. People were doing everything from the Macarena to the worm, and no one seemed to care if they were good at it or not. It was all about having fun, and that was exactly what everyone was doing. The living room had become a wild, unpredictable dance floor, full of people laughing, slipping, and falling over in the best possible way. The protagonist's phone buzzed again, and they glanced at it. It was a text from one of Dad's old friends. "This is the most fun I've had in years. You're a genius." The protagonists smiled to themselves. "Of course I am," they muttered under their breath. It felt good to be right, especially when they knew just how much they'd pulled off. The whole night had shifted from what was supposed to be a quiet evening to a ridiculous, full-throttle celebration. Everyone was in high spirits, caught up in the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, someone grabbed the microphone from the karaoke machine in the corner of the room. It was one of Dad's old friends, a guy who'd been the life of every party in his youth but was now, much like Dad, a little out of practice. He grabbed the mic with a flourish and declared, "All right, folks. Time for a little something special." He then launched into an off-key rendition of a 90s pop song, singing at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked in all the wrong places, but no one cared. Everyone was too busy dancing and laughing to even notice. The protagonist couldn't help but chuckle. The night was a complete disaster, in the best possible way. Mom, still watching her husband with a mix of exasperation and amusement, turned to the protagonist. "This was not what I was expecting," she said, shaking her head, but her smile was wide. She couldn't suppress her laughter, and neither could anyone else. The protagonist shrugged nonchalantly. "What did you expect? It's a surprise." "Not this kind of surprise," she replied, but there was no malice in her voice. She was clearly enjoying herself, just as everyone else was. At this point, it wasn't about the original intention anymore. The night had taken on a life of its own. A chaotic, messy, yet incredibly fun life. Dad, now fully caught up in the madness, tried to outdo everyone. He grabbed a pair of sunglasses and started doing the robot, a move that had the room in hysterics. He wasn't trying to be cool or smooth anymore. He was just having fun, and that made him look even more ridiculous. But it didn't matter. The energy in the room was electric. There was no judgment, just a group of people embracing the sheer ridiculousness of it all. The protagonist walked over to their mom, who was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down her face. "You know," the protagonist said, "I think he's actually enjoying himself more than he thought he would." Their mom wiped away a tear and nodded. I've never seen him like this before. As the night wore on, the party only got wilder. People were singing, dancing, and laughing uncontrollably. The protagonist was now standing off to the side, feeling like a proud parent watching their child perform at a school talent show. This was their moment. They had taken what could have been an ordinary evening and transformed it into a night no one would ever forget. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted when Dad suddenly grabbed them by the shoulder, slurring slightly from the alcohol. Hey, kid, you did this, didn't you? The protagonists tried to keep their face straight, but it was no use. They grinned. Maybe. You like it? I love it! Dad shouted over the music, giving them a bear hug that nearly knocked them over. This is the best night I've had in years. I'm glad you're having fun, the protagonist said, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The dance contest continued, but it had long since stopped being about the contest. It had become about the people, about celebrating the ridiculousness of life. The night was spiraling out of control, but in the most delightful way. The protagonist couldn't have asked for a better outcome. And then, as if on cue, the music stopped. A lull fell over the room, and for a moment, everyone looked around, unsure of what to do next. The silence was almost deafening, but it lasted only a second. All right, one of Dad's friends called out, holding up a bottle of wine. Who's ready for round 2? The room erupted in cheers. The protagonist had pulled it off. The surprise had been a resounding success, and they couldn't have been prouder of themselves. They sat back, surveying the chaos around them, a satisfied smile on their face.